An arrogant doctor in a $1,000 suit might know how to sign a death certificate, but he wouldn't last 5 seconds holding a severed artery in the pitch dark. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and take a moment to let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. My name is Hannah Mercer. For 18 months, the staff at St. Luke Medical Center knew me simply as the quiet trauma nurse who worked the graveyard shift. I kept my head down, completed my 12-hour rotations without a word of complaint, and never stayed around to gossip at the central station. To the hospital administration, I was just a reliable, soft-spoken nurse who quietly kept Trauma Bay 3 running with clinical precision. None of them knew about the heavy scars hidden beneath my dark navy scrubs, or the 6 years I spent as a Fleet Marine Force corpsman attached to 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in Ramadi and Sangin. I had knelt in the mud pulling wounded Marines out of burning vehicles while enemy rounds snapped overhead, performing emergency surgical procedures in dark combat tents with nothing more than a headlamp and my medical kit. When my active service ended, all I wanted was a peaceful, predictable civilian life where emergencies happened under bright fluorescent lights with fully stocked supply carts. Wherever I went, however, one item always stayed by my side: my old M5 combat medic bag. It was a heavy, olive-drab canvas pack with faded straps, hand-stitched repairs along the side pockets, and faint dark stains embedded deep in the fabric from dried blood spilled years ago in dusty combat zones. To an untrained eye, it looked like an antique piece of military surplus, but to me, that bag represented every life I had fought to save. Every roll of compressed gauze, every tourniquet, and every chest seal inside had been curated through trial by fire. In a war zone, that bag was the exact boundary between a Marine seeing his family again or returning home under a folded flag. At St. Luke Medical Center, clinical reality was rapidly being replaced by corporate optics, and no one embodied that dangerous shift more than Dr. Harrison Drake, our newly appointed Chief Medical Officer and Surgical Director. Dr. Drake was a man obsessed with image, prestige, and administrative metrics. He drove a luxury sports car, wore custom-tailored suits beneath a spotless lab coat, and treated the emergency department like a corporate boardroom. He was constantly talking about patient turnover rates, door-to-discharge portal timers, and insurance reimbursement tiers. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, he lacked the calm, unshakable grit required when a human being was actively bleeding out on a gurney. It was 11:30 p.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday night when Dr. Drake made his usual dramatic walk through the main emergency corridor. He was accompanied by 3 hospital board members and 2 senior surgical interns, showing them around as if he were guiding a real estate tour rather than managing a high-volume trauma center. I was standing at the central triage desk, quietly organizing patient charts and reviewing lab results with Mateo, a young resident nurse who had joined our shift 6 months earlier. "Check these arterial blood gas levels for bed 4, Mateo," I said softly, handing him a printed slip. "Her oxygen saturation is hovering at 92%. Keep her on 2 liters of nasal cannula until the attending physician reviews her chest film." "Got it, Hannah," Mateo replied, nodding with genuine respect. "You always catch those subtle drops before the monitors even alarm." Before I could answer, Dr. Sanat, Drake's sharp, booming voice echoed across the quiet station, cutting through the rhythmic hum of cardiac monitors. "Nurse Mercer," Dr. Drake announced loudly, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum floor as he walked over, flanked by the board members and interns. I looked up calmly from my screen. "Good evening, Dr. Drake." He stopped at the central counter, resting one hand on his hip while flipping through a digital tablet with the other. He frowned dramatically, making sure the visiting board members were paying close attention to his commanding presence. "Why hasn't the discharge summary for Bed 8 been finalized in the administrative portal?" Drake demanded, raising his voice so every nurse nearby could hear. "Our target door-to-discharge metric for low-acuity admissions is 45 minutes. Your shift is currently dragging down our overall efficiency score by 3 whole percentage points. Bed 8 is a 72-year-old diabetic patient with borderline blood pressure and a deep laceration on his forearm," I answered softly, keeping my voice level. I delayed his discharge papers until his post-suture dressing was verified and his mobility was stable. It was a clinical safety decision, Doctor. Drake scoffed loudly, turning toward the board members with an exaggerated roll of his eyes. A safety decision? Drake repeated, mocking my words with a condescending smirk. You see, gentlemen, this is precisely the friction we encounter with legacy nursing staff. They lack the dynamic speed, the agility, and the metric-driven focus required for a premier facility like St. Luke. You spend far too much time hovering over minor details instead of keeping the line moving. Mateo spoke up defensively from beside me. Doctor. Drake, Hannah was just making sure the patient didn't suffer a secondary bleed at home. I did not request your commentary, Nurse Mateo. Drake snapped, cutting the young man off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Nurse Mercer has displayed a concerning lack of urgency for months. She moves too quietly, speaks too softly, and frankly fails to project the high-energy, authoritative image this medical center demands. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or shift my posture. I had stood in dusty triage tents, while heavy mortar fire rattled the canvas walls. A vain administrator flexing his authority for corporate guests didn't move me in the slightest. I prioritize patient outcomes over portal metrics, Doctor, I stated simply. Drake's face flushed bright red at my calm response. He opened his mouth to deliver another sharp rebuke, but his eyes suddenly caught sight of something resting on the lower shelf beneath the central counter. It was my old M5 combat medic bag. Drake froze, his eyes bulging slightly as if he had just spotted a venomous snake resting inside a sterile operating room. He reached down with 2 manicured fingers, grabbing the canvas strap of the bag and yanking it out onto the clean counter with an exaggerated expression of utter disgust. What in God's name is this filthy eyesore doing in my emergency department? Drake shouted, pointing his finger at the worn canvas pack. That is my personal medical bag, Dr. Drake, I replied calmly. I keep it near my station during every shift. Your personal bag? Drake echoed, his voice rising into a theatrical pitch for the benefit of the board members. This piece of antique military surplus looks like it was dug out of a landfill. Look at these frayed straps. Look at these dark, filthy stains on the fabric. It is an absolute biohazard. The tools inside that bag are sterile packed, vacuum sealed, and organized for rapid emergency trauma response, I explained, looking him straight in the eye. The stains on the outside canvas are dried blood from soldiers I treated during active duty in combat zones. A heavy silence fell over the station. Mateo looked at the bag with deep reverence, while the surgical interns exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Drake, however, didn't care about combat history. To him, the worn canvas bag was an insult to his pristine, modern emergency department and a direct challenge to his authority. I do not care if this bag was used in the American Civil War, Nurse Mercer. Drake spat, his voice trembling with anger. St. Luke Medical Center has invested $2 million in modern digital trauma carts, automated supply dispensers, and standardized equipment. Bringing this ratty, obsolete piece of military trash into my department violates hospital sanitation protocols, ruins our professional aesthetic, and undermines our institutional hierarchy. Standard hospital carts are designed for controlled step-by-step procedures under bright lights, I said, my tone dropping into a firm, unshakable register. My M5 bag is designed for immediate life-saving stabilization when everything else fails. It stays with me. Drake's jaw tightened violently. His fragile ego, already bruised by my refusal to bow to his portal metrics, completely snapped in front of the board executives. He picked up the heavy M5 bag by its shoulder strap, swung it over the counter, and held it directly over the large red biohazard waste bin standing near the wall. You will listen to me very carefully, Nurse Mercer, Drake hissed, his voice dripping with venom as he glared at me. You work in my hospital, under my authority. You will rely strictly on our digital portal systems and standard supply carts. You will not bring this anti-hygienic piece of trash into my building ever again. Put my bag down, Dr. Drake, I said softly, my eyes locking onto his with a cold, lethal intensity that made the 2 surgical interns unconsciously step back. Drake sneered, hovering the bag directly over the open trash flap. If you refuse to throw this useless piece of military junk into the trash right now, I will sign an administrative suspension form for gross insubordination and breach of hospital sanitation protocol before this shift is over. You will hand over your ID badge and be escorted off these premises by security. I didn't blink. I didn't reach for the bag, and I didn't raise my voice. That bag has saved more lives than your portal metrics ever will, Doctor, I replied in a low, quiet voice that chilled the air between us. If you drop it in that bin, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your career. Drake stared at me, his hand shaking with rage as he held the faded canvas bag over the biohazard trash, waiting for me to break. Doctor, Drake didn't drop the bag into the biohazard bin, but the sneer on his face deepened as he pulled a red administrative suspension form from the desk clipboard. His hand trembled with manic anger as he scribbled his signature across the bottom, the plastic pen clicking loudly against the paper. You are suspended effective immediately, Nurse Mercer, Drake spat, slapping the signed paper hard against the central counter right beside my M5 bag. Gross insubordination, violation of sanitation protocols, and blatant defiance of executive authority. You will hand over your ID badge, pack your things, and vacate these premises right now. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, nor did I plead for my job. I simply unclipped my hospital ID badge from my scrub top, set it quietly on top of the red paper, slid my heavy canvas bag over my shoulder, and walked away. Hannah, wait! Mateo called out, rushing after me down the hallway, as the visiting board members stood in uncomfortable silence behind Dr. Drake. We stopped near the glass fire doors leading toward the rear parking lot. Outside, the rain was pounding furiously against the glass panels, the sound echoing through the concrete corridor. You can't just leave like this, Mateo gasped, his chest heaving as he looked at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. He's completely out of his mind. He suspended you over an old bag just to flex his authority in front of those corporate executives. You're the most experienced trauma nurse on this floor. It doesn't matter, Mateo, I said softly, adjusting the canvas strap on my shoulder. Dr. Drake is the chief medical officer. Fighting a vain bureaucrat over hospital policy changes nothing. Go back out there and make sure Bed 4 stays stable. It's not fair, Hannah, Mateo said, biting his lip as frustration welled up in his voice. He's going to ruin your file. Fairness doesn't exist in an emergency room, Mateo, I replied gently, giving his shoulder a firm pat. Only clinical competence and patient outcomes matter. Now go back to your shift. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the dark, damp night. The freezing downpour washed over my face, carrying away the artificial scent of floor wax and sanitizer. I pulled my dark windbreaker hood up and began walking across the wet asphalt toward my car parked near the perimeter fence. I was halfway across the dark parking lot when a sharp, deafening siren suddenly tore through the storm. Wah! 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 The hospital's roof-mounted emergency disaster sirens began to wail in a continuous high-pitched screech that echoed off the surrounding concrete buildings. High above the roofline, the red and yellow strobe lights of the disaster alert system cut through the rain-slicked darkness, flashing in rapid, frantic pulses. A second later, the outdoor public address speakers mounted along the concrete walls of the ambulance bay crackled to life with harsh static. Code Black! Mass casualty incident! Code Black! An operator's frantic voice boomed over the outdoor speakers, echoing across the entire parking lot. All available surgical personnel, trauma nurses, and ER staff report to the main ambulance bay immediately. Mass casualty protocol is active. I stopped dead in my tracks on the slick asphalt, turning around slowly to look back at the illuminated glass bay doors. Emergency strobe lights were flashing wildly through the rain. Through the heavy downpour, I heard a sound that made my military instincts instantly lock into place. It wasn't the usual high-pitched sing-song whine of civilian city ambulances. It was the deep, thunderous roar of heavy-duty tactical diesel engines, accompanied by the low, aggressive wail of military convoy sirens. Down the access road leading from the highway, a long line of flashing red and blue LED lights cut through the dark storm. 3 heavy military transport ambulances, followed by 4 high-speed tactical medical vehicles, swerved violently into the hospital's ambulance bay, their heavy tires screeching loudly against the wet concrete. These vehicles belonged to the United States Marine Corps base located up the interstate highway. Clear the bay! Clear the bay right now! A military voice boomed through an amplified vehicle speaker, as tactical medics in dark combat gear leaped from the front seats before the trucks even came to a full stop. The rear double doors of the leading military transport vehicle were thrown open with a violent metallic bang, revealing a nightmare of blood, torn woodland digital camouflage uniforms, and screaming chaos. A high-intensity tactical breaching exercise at the nearby Marine Corps base had suffered a catastrophic structural collapse and secondary explosive magazine detonation inside a concrete training bunker. 12 Marines from an elite combat engineer breaching element had been caught directly in the primary blast radius. The quiet ambulance bay instantly erupted into utter, terrifying pandemonium. Military corpsmen and civilian paramedics began pulling heavy tactical field gurneys out of the rear of the trucks, shouting vital signs, airway status, and injury reports over the roaring diesel engines and the pouring rain. "We have 12 Red 1 critical casualties!" A Marine corpsman screamed at the top of his lungs, his face covered in dark soot and fresh blood as he shoved a gurney into the dry bay. Multiple blast traumas, severe arterial lacerations, open thoracic wounds, and second-degree burns. We need an immediate trauma surgical triage. Wounded Marines were groaning in agony, their heavy tactical body armor sliced open with trauma shears, thick black tourniquets cranked tight around blood-soaked limbs. The iron scent of fresh arterial blood mixed heavily with the smell of burnt cordite, melted nylon, and wet concrete. Inside the glass doors, the civilian hospital staff were running in frantic, disorganized circles, completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume and violence of the trauma rolling into their facility. St. Luke was accustomed to highway fender benders, ladder falls, and minor lacerations, not 12 heavily armed, battle-hardened Marines covered in blast shrapnel and screaming in adrenaline-fueled shock. Stepping through the central glass doors into the middle of the ambulance bay was Dr. Harrison Drake. He was still wearing his pristine, spotless white lab coat, holding his digital tablet in his hand, attempting to project calm authority as the chief medical officer. But the moment his eyes took in the bloody, chaotic reality of 12 critical blast victims spilling across his bay floor all at once, his face drained of all color, turning a ghostly ashen white. What is all of this?" Drake stammered, his voice rising into a high-pitched, hysterical whimper as 2 paramedics wheeled a screaming, blood-covered Marine right past him, dark blood splashing onto the pristine hem of his lab coat. "Why wasn't I notified of a military convoy transfer? Where are the field admission charts?" "Charts?" the lead Marine corpsman roared, stepping up and grabbing Drake by the lapels of his coat with blood-stained gloves, shoving him toward the first row of gurneys. "We don't have charts, doctor. We have 12 men bleeding to death on your floor. Set up a primary triage line right now and start calling every surgeon in this city." Drake froze completely. His eyes bulged in sheer, unadulterated terror as he looked down at the dark arterial blood staining his white lab coat. His hands began to shake violently, dropping his digital tablet onto the wet concrete floor, the glass screen shattering instantly. The arrogant, condescending authority he had displayed earlier in the quiet corridor vanished completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. I can't triage 12 blast traumas at once," Drake shrieked, backing away toward the wall like a frightened child, his trembling hands held up defensively in the air. "The bay is overcrowded. Stop bringing them out of the trucks. Keep them in the ambulances until we process administrative intake forms." A wounded Marine sergeant sitting up on the nearest gurney, his left arm bound in a tight tourniquet, and dark blood soaking through a pressure dressing on his thigh, looked up at Drake with pure, lethal contempt. "Is this coward serious?" the sergeant growled, his voice gravelly and dangerous as he spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. "He wants us to sit in the trucks while my men bleed out?" Drake cowered against the concrete wall, completely paralyzed by the noise, the smell of blood, and the raw, aggressive presence of 12 wounded Marines fighting for survival. He held his hands over his ears, trembling uncontrollably as the lead corpsman screamed for surgical support. I stood 50 yards away at the edge of the dark, rain-slicked parking lot, holding my heavy M5 canvas bag, watching the chief medical officer collapse into total, pathetic incompetence. I stood at the dark, rain-slicked edge of the parking lot, my heavy canvas M5 bag slung over my shoulder, watching the total, pathetic collapse of Dr. Harrison Drake. The freezing rain poured off the brim of my windbreaker hood, but my eyes remained locked on the lit ambulance bay, where chaos was rapidly morphing into an outright catastrophe. Inside the bay, the situation was spiraling out of control. The thunderous roar of the idling tactical diesel engines mixed with the low wail of military convoy sirens, the deafening downpour hitting the metal overhang, and the frantic shouts of terrified civilian medical staff. 12 wounded Marines lay on heavy field gurneys, their woodland digital camouflage uniforms torn open, dark arterial blood pooling on the wet concrete floor. Dr. Drake was pressed against the concrete wall like a frightened animal, his face pale as chalk, his pristine white lab coat stained with dark purple blood splatters. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he held them over his ears, his shattered digital tablet lying uselessly at his feet on the wet floor. "Stop bringing them out!" Drake shrieked, his voice cracking into an embarrassing, high-pitched whimper that echoed over the roaring engines. "You cannot move 12 critical trauma casualties into my emergency department without digital administrative intake. We do not have 12 open trauma beds on the portal system. You are violating cross-contamination protocols and hospital admission regulations." The lead Marine corpsman, a battle-tested petty officer first class, whose face was covered in black soot and fresh blood, turned on Drake with pure, lethal fury. "Admission regulations?" the corpsman roared, stepping directly into Drake's face, his chest heaving under a blood-stained tactical vest. "Doctor, these men were caught in a secondary explosive magazine detonation during a live fire-breaching drill. 3 of them have open pneumothoraces, 2 have active femoral arterial bleeds held only by field combat tourniquets, and 4 are slipping into profound hypovolemic shock. If they don't get immediate trauma intervention, they will be dead in 10 minutes. Get out of my way and open those doors. I am the Chief Medical Officer and Surgical Director of St. Luke!" Drake screamed back, trying desperately to sound authoritative, though his knees were visibly shaking beneath his trousers. "You do not bark orders at me in my own facility. I order all transport vehicles to hold outside. We will process 1 patient at a time through standard digital triage desk check-in." Standing nearby, young resident nurse Mateo looked at Drake in absolute horrified disbelief. "Dr. Drake, what are you doing?" Mateo yelled over the roaring storm. "We have open space in the central corridor. If we don't bring them inside and start primary assessment right now, these men are going to bleed to death on the concrete." "Silence, Nurse Mateo!" Drake barked, his eyes wide with wild, manic panic. "I am in primary command of this floor. I will not allow this department to be turned into a chaotic, unsanitary war zone." Before Mateo could reply, a blinding flash of blue-white light illuminated the entire sky above the hospital. Boom! A violent bolt of lightning struck the main electrical substation just 200 yards behind the building. A deafening metallic explosion echoed through the air, sending a shower of sparks raining down into the night. Instantly, every single overhead fluorescent light in the ambulance bay sizzled and died. The bright lights vanished, plunging the entire emergency bay and central corridor into pitch-black darkness. A second later, the digital telemetry monitors, automated blood pressure cuffs, electronic medication dispensers, and wall-mounted portal display screens flickered twice and went completely dead. A low, eerie hum filled the room as the hospital's primary power grid collapsed entirely. High above the roofline, the emergency backup generator attempted to kick in, coughing twice before sputtering out under the heavy storm surge. Only a few faint flickering amber emergency lights along the baseboards stayed lit, casting long, eerie shadows across the dark, blood-slicked bay floor. A wave of utter, hysterical panic erupted among the civilian hospital staff. "The power's out!" a nurse screamed in the dark. "The portal screens are down! We lost all patient files!" A surgical resident panicked, knocking over an instrument tray with a loud metallic clatter. "We can't access electronic medication orders. The automated supply carts are locked." Inside the dim, amber-lit bay, the darkness turned the chaos into a nightmare. Without bright overhead lights and digital monitors screaming numbers, the civilian medical team was completely blind. They had been trained on digital systems, electronic algorithms, and automated portal prompts. Stripped of their screens, they didn't know how to assess a pulse by touch or evaluate breath sounds by eye. Dr. E. Harrison Drake lost his mind completely. "Where are the backup monitors?" Drake screamed, his voice rising into a terrified, manic shriek as he stumbled through the dark, bumping hard into a rolling IV pole. Why isn't the generator working? Get the IT department on the phone. We cannot operate without digital portal telemetry. Forget the damn computers, Doc, the lead Marine Corpsman yelled, using a small tactical pen light to illuminate a gurney near the door. My corporal is crashing. His blood pressure is dropping through the floor. On the tactical gurney, a burly Marine gunnery sergeant named Frank Callahan sat upright. Dark arterial blood was soaking heavily through an improvised pressure dressing wrapped around his right thigh, and severe flash burns blackened the skin along the left side of his neck and jaw. Despite the agonizing pain clearly racking his broad frame, his sharp, dark eyes were cold, alert, and entirely focused on Drake. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan had survived 2 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He knew the exact difference between a real trauma leader under fire and a terrified fraud hiding behind a white coat. "Doctor, get over here right now," Mateo called out frantically from beside a second gurney, where a young Marine corporal was gasping for air, his lips turning a dark, cyanotic blue. "He's in acute respiratory distress. His chest is barely moving on the left side, Doctor." Drake stumbled over to the gurney in the dim amber light, his breathing ragged and shallow, cold sweat dripping from his chin. He looked down at the young corporal, whose skin was freezing cold and covered in clammy sweat. Without digital monitors displaying oxygen saturation or blood pressure readings, Drake was completely helpless. He reached out with trembling hands, grabbing a stethoscope from his pocket, but his hands were shaking so violently he dropped it onto the blood-stained sheet. I can't read his vitals," Drake stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the dark room. "Where's the pulse oximeter? Where's the digital arterial line readout? I need a baseline telemetry assessment before I can initiate clinical protocol." "He doesn't need a baseline telemetry assessment. He needs his airway secured," Mateo yelled, shining his phone's flashlight onto the patient's face. "Look at his neck veins. They're distended. He's going into shock. He's in acute neurogenic agitation," Drake shouted back, his voice cracked with manic panic as he grabbed a syringe from a nearby crash cart tray. "He's thrashing because of cerebral hypoxia. I need to sedate him immediately. Get me 50 milligrams of propofol and a paralytic agent. We need to intubate him right now." "Doctor, no," Mateo gasped, stepping between Drake and the patient. "If his blood pressure is crashing from internal bleeding or a tension pneumothorax, giving him a heavy sedative and paralytics right now will kill him. His heart will stop in 30 seconds. "Get out of my way, Nurse Mateo," Drake roared, his face contorted in sheer, unadulterated terror and rage as he tried to push past the young nurse with the syringe. "I am a board-certified surgeon and chief medical officer. Airway management takes absolute priority according to standard emergency guidelines. I am administering the paralytic." On the adjacent gurney, Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan watched Drake's trembling hands and manic eyes in the dim light. Callahan saw the syringe in Drake's shaking fingers, saw the complete lack of clinical diagnosis, and smelled the suffocating scent of a terrified coward about to execute a soldier out of sheer panic. Callahan flexed his good leg, reached across the narrow gap between the gurneys, and grabbed Dr. Drake by the front of his blood-stained lab coat with crushing iron force. "Clench!" Callahan pulled the chief medical officer down until Drake's trembling face was only 3 inches from his own blood-splattered jaw. "You put that needle anywhere near my Marine suit," Gunnery Sergeant Callahan growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that cut through the screams and the storm like a serrated blade, "and I will tear your throat out with my bare hands." Drake shrieked in sudden terror, dropping the syringe onto the floor as he tried frantically to pull away from Callahan's iron grip. "Security! Security, arrest this man! He's assaulting a hospital official." "Security isn't coming for you, Doc," Callahan spat, his eyes burning with lethal, unyielding military contempt as he shoved Drake backward into a rolling supply cart, sending stainless steel bowls clattering across the dark floor. Drake scrambled against the wall, clutching his chest, breathing in shallow, hysterical gasps as the wounded Marines groaned in agony around him. The darkness in the bay grew thicker, the smell of blood stronger, and the civilian medical team stood completely paralyzed in the pitch-black emergency room, unable to take a single step without digital screens to guide them. I stood 30 yards away at the edge of the rain-soaked parking lot, holding my old M5 combat medic bag, watching the entire hospital collapse into pitch-black horror. I stood at the edge of the rain-soaked pavement for only 2 seconds longer. Through the heavy downpour and the dim, flickering amber emergency lights of the ambulance bay, I watched Dr. Harrison Drake cowering against the cold concrete wall, his hands pressed tightly over his head, completely undone by the sudden darkness and the raw, unscripted reality of blood and combat trauma. The hospital's multi-million-dollar digital infrastructure was dead, the portal screens were pitch black, and the automated supply carts were locked tight behind unresponsive electronic keypads. The civilian medical team was frozen in place, lost in the shadows, utterly helpless without digital monitors telling them what to do. And on those 12 field gurneys, battle-hardened Marines were groaning, bleeding, and fighting for air in the dark. I adjusted the heavy canvas strap on my shoulder. My administrative suspension paper was sitting inside on the central counter, signed in bright red ink. But out here, on this blood-slicked concrete floor, a piece of paper signed by a terrified bureaucrat meant nothing. Clinical survival meant everything. I turned around, pushed through the heavy glass fire doors, and stepped straight back into the dark, chaotic ambulance bay. My boots made a steady, deliberate sound against the wet linoleum floor as I walked past the paralyzed surgical residents and panicked floor nurses. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't look at Dr. Drake. I unslung my heavy, olive-drab M5 combat medic bag and set it down hard on the stainless steel central triage table with a loud, metallic thud. Thud. The heavy sound echoed through the dim, shadow-filled bay, cutting clean through the frantic murmurs and terrified whispers of the civilian staff. Mateo turned his head quickly, his phone's flashlight beam catching my face in the amber gloom. His eyes lit up with intense, overwhelming relief. "Hannah," Mateo breathed out, his voice shaking with emotion. You came back." "I never left, Mateo," I said softly, my voice completely flat, calm, and unshakable. Dr. Drake scrambled up from the wall, wiping cold sweat from his forehead with his blood-stained lab coat sleeve. When his eyes caught sight of me standing over the central counter in the dim light, his terrified panic instantly flared back into manic, desperate rage. "What are you doing back in my department?" Drake shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You are under active administrative suspension. You were ordered off these premises immediately. Security! Get security over here right now! Security is at the main entrance dealing with the building blackout, Doctor," Mateo yelled back, stepping boldly in front of Drake. "Look around you. The digital portal is completely dead. The automated supply carts are locked tight. The patients are crashing right now." "I don't care," Drake screamed, backing away toward the locked electronic supply cabinet, his hands shaking violently as he repeatedly slammed his fingers against the dead digital keypad. Beep, beep, beep. The small LCD screen remained completely dark. The electronic dispensation system is unresponsive. We cannot access sterile surgical trays, vascular clamps, or airway kits without administrative authorization override. We have to wait for the IT department and facilities management to reset the circuit breakers. "We don't have 4 minutes for an IT department reset, Doctor," I stated, my voice dropping into a low, icy register that chilled every person standing nearby. "These men have 4 minutes before their bodies enter irreversible hypovolemic shock." Without waiting for another useless word from Drake, I reached down and unbuckled the heavy metal quick-release clasps of my old M5 canvas bag. Click, click. With 2 smooth, practiced movements, I unzipped the reinforced main compartment and flipped the thick canvas flaps wide open under the flickering amber emergency lights. A collective, stunned hush washed over the nearby corpsmen, civilian nurses, and surgical residents. Inside the worn, hand-stitched olive-drab pack was not a random collection of antique clutter, but an absolute masterclass in tactical combat medicine. Everything was organized with microscopic, instinctual precision, vacuum-sealed in heavy industrial plastic, categorized by immediate trauma priority, and held securely in place by heavy elastic webbing that had been custom-fitted through years of field experience in active war zones. In the top pouch lay 8 Generation 7 CAT combat application tourniquets, pre-threaded and folded for instant one-handed application. Beside them sat 4 vacuum-compressed rolls of quick-clot combat gauze impregnated with kaolin hemostatic agent engineered to force deep arterial clotting in seconds under severe pressure. In the lateral elastic webbing rested three 14-gauge, 3¼ inch tension, pneumothorax decompression needles, encased in hard protective polymer tubes. Below them were sterile nasopharyngeal airways, pre-lubricated, and ready for immediate blind insertion. Chest seals with 3-way flutter valves designed to vent trapped thoracic air without letting atmospheric pressure collapse a lung, and 2 heavy junctional tourniquets, built specifically for groin and axillary blast injuries, where standard extremity wraps couldn't reach. There were no digital screens inside that bag. There were no electronic sensors, no battery-operated pumps, and no portal software logins required. Every single item inside that canvas pack was purely mechanical, battle-tested, and built to function flawlessly in mud, darkness, torrential rain, or total blackout. "Look at that kit," a young civilian resident whispered, stepping closer to the central table, his eyes wide in utter astonishment as his flashlight beam illuminated the vacuum-sealed tactical gear. "It's all specialized trauma gear, perfectly organized for immediate life-saving response." "It's not just trauma gear," a voice growled from the nearest gurney. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan leaned forward on his elbows, ignoring the excruciating pain in his blood-soaked right thigh. He shined his small tactical penlight directly onto the side flap of my open M5 bag. There, hand-drawn in dark, permanent marker on the faded canvas fold, was a small, worn emblem. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps, flanked by the caduceus insignia of a Fleet Marine Force corpsman, and the faded call sign, Doc Mercer. Callahan's dark, bloodshot eyes snapped up from the canvas flap, locking directly onto my face with a look of intense, razor-sharp military recognition. "Fleet Marine Force," Callahan rasped out, his gravelly voice vibrating with sudden, profound authority through the dim bay. "You're a Navy corpsman." The lead Marine corpsman, Petty Officer First Class Jenkins, stepped over from the second gurney, his face covered in black soot and fresh blood as he stared at my hands resting calmly over the open M5 bag. "Doc Mercer?" Jenkins gasped, his jaw dropping in total awestruck disbelief as his penlight illuminated my face. "2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, Sangain Valley?" "That's right, Petty Officer," I answered softly, looking Jenkins dead in the eye. "I was attached to 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in Sangain Valley." A sudden, powerful ripple passed through the 12 wounded Marines lying on the gurneys. The atmosphere inside the pitch-black ambulance bay shifted instantly and completely. The fear, confusion, and defensiveness that had gripped the soldiers since their arrival vanished in a single, collective heartbeat. To these men, Dr. Harrison Drake was just a terrified civilian bureaucrat in a white coat who panicked when the lights went out and tried to hide behind digital forms. But an FMF corpsman standing over an open M5 bag was family. It was the trusted professional who stood between them and the grave, when everything else burned to ash in the dark. "Doc's on the floor," a wounded corporal on a rear gurney whispered, his head dropping back against his pillow with a deep, shuddering sigh of pure relief. "We got a real corpsman in here." "Doc," another Marine groaned softly, his tense body relaxing against the bloody sheet. "We're gonna be okay now. Dr." Drake stood beside the dark, unresponsive electronic supply cabinet, his face contorted in sheer, hysterical fury as he watched his institutional authority completely dissolve in front of his eyes. "This is absurd!" Drake shrieked, shoving his way back toward the triage table, waving his trembling hands frantically in my direction. "I don't care what kind of military surplus you have in that dirty canvas bag, Nurse Mercer. You are a suspended employee. I am the chief medical officer of this hospital. I strictly forbid you from using unapproved non-hospital equipment on these patients. Put those unauthorized tools away immediately." I didn't argue with him. I didn't even turn my head to look at him. I simply reached into the top compartment of my M5 bag, pulled out a pair of sterile surgical trauma shears and 2 pre-folded cat tourniquets, snapping a pair of heavy nitrile gloves onto my hands with a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the dark room. "Snap. Mateo," I commanded, my voice low, sharp, and ringing with absolute, unshakable clinical authority that filled the entire space. "Hold your flashlight steady over bed 1. We are starting primary stabilization right now. Yes, Doc. Mateo answered instantly, stepping up to my side without a second of hesitation, leaving Dr. Drake standing completely isolated in the dark. Drake stood frozen beside the counter, his mouth hanging half open, his face burning with a mixture of profound humiliation, utter helplessness, and blinding toxic rage as he watched me take absolute command of his emergency department in the dark. Doctor. Harrison Drake made a desperate, sweeping motion with his hands, trying to step between Mateo and me as I pulled the sterile trauma shears from my open M5 bag. His face was a contorted mask of sweat and crimson rage in the flickering amber emergency light, his white lab coat stained with dark purple blood. "I am giving you a direct medical order, Nurse Mercer," Drake shrieked, his voice echoing hysterically off the concrete walls of the dark bay. "You do not touch a single patient in this building. You are suspended. I will have you stripped of your nursing license by morning. Mateo, step back from that table right now, or you will be terminated alongside her." Mateo didn't move an inch. He held his phone's flashlight beam steady over my open bag, his jaw set like solid granite. "Doctor, she's a Fleet Marine Force corpsman," Mateo yelled back, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "She knows how to stabilize these men without digital monitors. You dropped your stethoscope on the floor and panicked because the power went out. That is insubordination," Drake screamed, turning toward two young civilian surgical residents who were standing nearby in the dark, holding unlit flashlights. "Dr. Miller, Dr. Eris, step forward and secure these unauthorized supplies immediately. Force these military personnel back into their transport vehicles until the backup generators are restored and we can process administrative digital intake." The two young residents looked at Drake in absolute terror, then looked at the 12 wounded Marines lying on the field gurneys. Neither of them took a single step forward. "Are you deaf?" Drake shouted, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. "I am the Chief Medical Officer of St. Luke. Execute my order." Before the residents could even open their mouths, a sound shattered the tension in the room. A roar so loud, deep, and thunderous that it vibrated through the concrete floor and shook the stainless steel instrument trays. "Marines, lock it down!" Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan sat straight up on his tactical gurney. His right leg was drenched in dark arterial blood, and severe flash burns covered the left side of his neck and jaw. Yet, despite the agonizing pain racking his broad frame, his chest expanded as he bellowed across the pitch-black bay with the fierce, terrifying power of a parade deck commander. "Refuse all civilian care," Callahan ordered, his gravelly voice cutting through the darkness like a serrated blade. "Hands off. Nobody touches a single man in this unit until Doc Mercer gives the order." "Oorah!" The 11 wounded Marines barked in unison, their raspy, blood-choked voices echoing together through the dark room. In less than 3 seconds, the ambulance bay transformed into an active military mutiny. When Dr. Eris, one of the young residents, nervously tried to step toward a gurney with an empty plastic tray, a wounded Marine corporal with a severe shrapnel laceration across his forearm reached out with his good arm and shoved the resident's chest hard, sending him stumbling backward into a rolling cart. "Back off, suit," the corporal growled, his eyes burning with lethal military warning in the dim light. Across the room, a civilian floor nurse tried to apply a standard manual blood pressure cuff to a Marine suffering from an open thoracic wound. The soldier sat up, slapped the Velcro cuff straight out of her hands, and pointed a dark, soot-stained finger at her face. "I said hands off!" the Marine barked, his breathing shallow and gasping. "Doc's on the floor! Nobody touches us except Doc!" "Are you completely insane?" Dr. Drake shrieked, scrambling backward into the shadow of the central counter as the wounded Marines locked down their positions, refusing every piece of civilian equipment. "This is an illegal medical mutiny. You are refusing life-saving emergency care in a civilian facility. I will document every single one of your deaths as a formal refusal of medical treatment." Gunnery Sergeant Callahan turned his head slowly, looking directly at Drake with pure, unadulterated contempt. He spat a mouthful of dark blood onto the floor right in front of Drake's leather shoes. "I wouldn't let you wrap a bandage around my finger, Doc," Callahan spat, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly rumble. "You're terrified of the dark. You're trembling like a leaf, and you don't have the slightest damn clue how to triage a blast injury without a computer screen telling you what button to push. You'd kill half my unit before you even figured out how to turn your digital monitors back on. I have 20 years of medical training, Drake screamed, his hands shaking violently as he pointed at Callahan. I am the surgical director. I don't care if you're the president of the United States, Callahan growled, leaning forward on his gurney, his dark eyes ablaze. I obey leaders who know what the hell they're doing when bullets start flying and blood hits the dirt. And the only person in this entire damn building who knows how to pull a Marine out of a blast crater is Doc Mercer. Callahan looked away from Drake, turning his sharp, weathered face toward Petty Officer Jenkins and the 11 wounded men lying in the shadows. Marines! Callahan shouted, his voice carrying the absolute, unshakable weight of military command. Doc Mercer has primary tactical command of this floor. You follow her orders and only her orders. Am I understood? Sir, yes, sir, the wounded Marines responded in unison, their disciplined voices ringing clearly through the dark bay. The entire civilian medical staff stood completely frozen in shock. The surgical residents dropped their hands to their sides. The floor nurses backed away toward the walls. And Dr. Harrison Drake stood paralyzed against the central counter, his white coat stained with blood, his authority completely stripped away in front of his entire department. I didn't waste a single heartbeat. I didn't celebrate, and I didn't look at Drake. In a mass casualty situation where men were bleeding out in the dark, every second was measured in drops of arterial blood. I stepped directly into the center of the dark bay, taking my place at the head of the main triage line. The quiet, soft-spoken floor nurse named Hannah Mercer vanished completely. In her place stood Senior Chief Hospital Corpsman Hannah Mercer, the Fleet Marine Force combat medic who had run triage under heavy mortar fire in Sangan Valley. Mateo, I commanded, my voice sharp, clear, and ringing with absolute authority that instantly snapped the civilian staff out of their panic. Yes, Doc, Mateo replied, stepping forward instantly. I need primary illumination in this bay right now, I ordered. Jenkins, get the drivers of those tactical trucks to turn their high-beam LED headlights straight through these glass doors. Flood this floor with light. Moving, Jenkins yelled, sprinting out into the rain toward the idling military ambulances. 10 seconds later, 3 massive sets of high-intensity tactical LED headlights blazed to life through the heavy glass bay doors. Thick, blinding beams of white light cut straight through the darkness, illuminating the entire ambulance bay in a brilliant, crisp glare. The shadows vanished instantly, revealing every bloody gurney, every torn camouflage uniform, and every pool of arterial blood on the floor. Lucas! I called out, turning toward Mateo and 2 civilian nurses who were standing by. We are establishing 3 primary tactical triage zones right now. No waiting for digital portal files. We triage by clinical visual assessment and palpation. I pointed toward the 2 fully equipped bays at the front of the department. Zone Red is bays 1 and 2, I announced, my voice carrying over the sound of the storm and idling engines. Zone Red is strictly for critical airways, open thoracic pneumothoraces, and active arterial hemorrhages. Bed 1 and Bed 4 move to Zone Red immediately. Got it! Zone Red in bays 1 and 2, Mateo shouted, directing 2 corpsmen as they grabbed the handles of Bed 1 and rolled the gurney forward under the bright headlights. Zone Yellow is the central corridor, I continued, pointing down the wide hallway behind the triage desk. Zone Yellow is for stable fractures, deep muscular lacerations, and secondary blast shrapnel. Beds 5 through 9 move to Zone Yellow, keep pressure dressings tight, and monitor peripheral pulses every 3 minutes by hand. Moving beds 5 through 9 to Zone Yellow, a civilian nurse called out, stepping up alongside a Marine corpsman to push the gurneys into the corridor. And Zone Green is the main waiting lounge, I commanded, pointing toward the wide lobby doors. Zone Green is for ambulatory casualties, minor blast burns, and acoustic trauma. Beds 10 through 12 move to Zone Green. Supply them with sterile water, dry burn dressings, and oral rehydration. The entire room erupted into a whirlwind of synchronized high-efficiency motion. The civilian nurses, surgical residents, and military corpsmen, who moments ago had been running in confused, panicked circles, were now moving with fluid, disciplined precision under my direct orders. The fear that had paralyzed the department vanished, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of an organized combat medical unit. I stepped up to bed 1, where Corporal Adams lay gasping for air under the bright beam of the truck headlights, dark blood soaking heavily through his thigh dressing. I reached into my open M5 bag, pulled out a pair of trauma shears and a 14-gauge decompression needle, and looked at Mateo. "Mateo, prepare the quick clot gauze," I said calmly, my hands completely steady as I prepped the chest site. "We're going to work." Dr. Harrison Drake cowered against the wall in the corner, completely ignored by every doctor, nurse, and soldier in the room, as I took total, unshakable command of the trauma floor, ready to output the exact string. The tactical truck headlights cut through the darkness, casting sharp shadows across the blood-slicked floor as we settled into a high-intensity battle for survival. I stood beside bed 1, where Corporal Adams lay gasping for air. His chest rose unevenly, his right side expanding while his left side remained completely fixed and immobile. His face was a dark, cyanotic blue, his lips trembling as cold sweat poured down his forehead. "Mateo, shine that light right on his upper chest," I commanded, my voice flat, calm, and completely focused. "Look at the trachea. It's shifting to the right. The trapped air inside his pleural cavity is pushing his lungs and heart out of alignment. He has a massive tension pneumothorax." "What do we need, Doc?" Mateo asked, holding his phone's flashlight steady while the truck headlights illuminated the patient's torso. 14-gauge decompression needle from the front pouch of my M5 bag," I instructed swiftly. "Jenkins, hold his left shoulder steady." "Got it, Doc," Jenkins replied, leaning his soot-covered frame over the gurney, pinning Adam's upper torso down with a practiced military grip. I reached into my open M5 pack and retrieved the polymer tube containing the 3¼ inch tension pneumothorax needle. I twisted the cap, pulled the sterile catheter assembly free, and brought my gloved fingers to Adams's chest wall. My fingers mapped the bony landmarks by instinct, feeling down to the second intercostal space just above the third rib. "Hold your breath, Corporal," I whispered softly into Adams's ear. With a firm, decisive thrust, I drove the long needle straight through the intercostal muscle fascia into the pleural space. Hiss! A loud, high-pitched rush of trapped, pressurized air blasted out through the needle barrel, spraying a fine mist of blood against my gloved thumb. Instantly, the extreme tension crushing Adams's left lung collapsed. The cyanotic tint drained from his lips as his left lung expanded. He pulled in a deep gasp of fresh air, his chest rising symmetrically. "Airway restored," I announced calmly, sliding the metal needle out while leaving the flexible plastic catheter anchored in his chest wall, securing it with medical tape from my kit. "Pneumothorax relieved. Pulse is leveling out." Mateo let out a breathless laugh of pure disbelief. "You did that by touch. In 5 seconds. No digital portal needed," Jenkins grunted with a fierce grin. "That's how FMF corpsmen do it." Don't celebrate yet," I said, moving my hand straight down to Adams's upper right thigh. "We still have an active arterial bleed to secure." I sliced Adams's trousers open, exposing a jagged shrapnel laceration across his upper quadriceps. Pulsating red blood surged out from beneath the torn fascia. "The field tourniquet slipped during transport," I diagnosed, assessing the wound site with my fingers. "The laceration is too high for a standard extremity wrap. It's right near the inguinal fold. We need a junctional pressure pack." I reached into the lateral pocket of my M5 bag, pulling out a vacuum-sealed roll of quick-clot combat gauze impregnated with kaolin hemostatic agent. "Mateo, I need you to hold direct pressure on the proximal femoral artery right at the pelvic crease while I pack this cavity," I ordered. "When I say go, lean your full body weight into it." "Ready, Doc," Mateo said, setting his jaw and pressing his gloved hands firmly into the patient's groin crease. I unsealed the quick clot roll, packed the kaolin-treated gauze deep into the bleeding muscle cavity, and pressed it directly against the severed vessel wall until the wound was tightly packed. "Now, Mateo, heavy manual pressure, 3 minutes without releasing," I commanded. Mateo leaned his entire upper body forward, pressing his weight down into the wound while I pulled a heavy elastic compression bandage from my pack to wrap tightly over the packing. While Mateo held pressure, Dr. Drake stumbled from the shadows, desperate to reclaim control before his staff. "Stop right there!" Drake screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he shoved his way between two young residents, brandishing a pre-filled syringe he had grabbed from an open crash cart tray in the dark. "You are violating basic clinical protocol. You inserted an unauthorized chest catheter without radiological verification. I am taking control of this patient's airway immediately." Drake lunged forward over bed 1, pushing his hands toward Adams with the syringe containing propofol and a paralytic agent. "He needs immediate intubation," Drake shrieked. "I am the chief medical officer. Hand me the laryngoscope." "Doctor, get away from him," Mateo yelled, trying to block Drake with his elbow while keeping his weight pressed against the femoral artery. "His blood pressure is barely stabilizing from hypovolemic shock. If you give him paralytics right now, his heart will stop." "Shut up, Nurse Mateo," Drake roared, his face contorted in sheer, unadulterated madness. "I am a board-certified surgeon. I dictate medical management in this hospital." Drake raised the syringe, attempting to force the needle into Adams's intravenous line port. Before the needle could touch the port, my left hand shot out like an iron vice, clamping around Dr. Drake's wrist with crushing force. "Clench." "Ah!" Drake shrieked in sudden pain, his eyes bulging as he tried frantically to pull his arm back. "Let go of me. That is assault on a hospital official." I leaned forward, until my face was inches from his, my eyes burning with a cold intensity that froze him. "If you inject that paralytic into a patient suffering from acute hypovolemia," I said, my voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that echoed through the silent bay, "his sympathetic vascular tone will collapse in 10 seconds. His blood pressure will drop to 0, and he will flatline on this gurney before you can even open his jaw. You are about to murder a United States Marine because you don't know how to read a pulse without a computer screen. I am the surgical director," Drake stammered, his voice trembling violently as he tried and failed to break my grip. "You are a coward who panics when the lights go out," I spat softly. I twisted my wrist inward, forcing Drake's fingers to unclamp. The syringe slipped from his hands, falling onto the floor and shattering against the wet concrete. With a firm, decisive shove, I pushed Drake backward. He stumbled over a rolling footstool, crashing hard against the wall before sliding down into the dark corner beside the trash bins. "Jenkins!" I called out without looking back at Drake. "Keep him away from these beds." "With pleasure, Doc," Jenkins growled, stepping between Drake and the triage line, his broad, soot-covered chest blocking the disgraced doctor entirely. Drake sat on the floor, clutching his wrist and sobbing in the dark as the staff looked at him with disgust. I turned my full attention back to the gurneys. "Mateo, 3 minutes are up. Release the pressure gently." Mateo slowly lifted his hands. The quick clot gauze inside Adam's thigh wound had reacted with the blood proteins, forming a dense, rock-solid hemostatic clot. The bright red arterial bleeding had stopped completely. "Vascular flow secured," I reported, wrapping the heavy compression bandage firmly around his thigh. "Corporal Adams is stable. Move him to zone yellow for secondary monitoring." "On it, Doc," 2 corpsmen called out, rolling bed 1 down the corridor. Moving to bed 2, I found Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan pressing a blood-soaked towel against his thigh. "Better now that you're running this floor, Doc," Callahan rasped. I cleaned and packed his shrapnel wound with practiced speed. For the next 2 hours, the ambulance bay operated like a combat surgical field hospital. Under the tactical truck headlights, Mateo, Jenkins, and I worked through the remaining wounded Marines without digital monitors or automated carts. When bed 3 presented with an axillary laceration, I pulled a junctional tourniquet from my bag, anchoring the plate against the subclavian artery. On bed 5, a corporal with airway edema received a nasopharyngeal airway. On bed 7, Mateo held pressure while I placed sterile compression dressings. The civilian residents watched in awe, then stepped up alongside us, holding flashlights and assisting under my direct guidance. By 4:30 a.m., the rain lessened to a steady drizzle. All 12 wounded Marines had been triaged, stabilized, and secured. Not a single soldier was lost. I stood beside the central triage counter, my dark navy scrubs stained with blood and soot, my hands tired, but my mind completely calm. I wiped my surgical gloves clean with a sterile towel, and began repacking my remaining supplies into my M5 bag. Beside me, Mateo leaned against the counter, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked around the brightly lit bay at 12 living, breathing Marines. "Hannah," Mateo said softly, his voice filled with overwhelming respect. "You just saved 12 lives in the pitch dark with nothing but what was inside that old bag." "That bag never fails, Mateo," I replied softly, buckling the heavy metal quick-release clasps shut. Click, click. Instantly, the hospital's power grid surged back to life. Overhead lights flickered and buzzed back on. Digital portal screens booted up. Automated supply carts unlocked, and cardiac monitors chimed across the room. As the bright hospital lights restored full visibility, the heavy glass fire doors parted with a loud hum. Stepping through the doorway was Mr. Victor Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of St. Luke Medical Center, flanked by Colonel Jonathan Hayes, Regional Director for Veterans Affairs, and 4 armed military police officers. Let's print and review the exact text that will be outputted. Mr. Victor Sterling, CEO of St. Luke Medical Center, strode into the brightly lit ambulance bay with a grim expression. Flanking him was Colonel Jonathan Hayes, Regional Director for Veterans Affairs, alongside 4 armed military police officers whose tactical vests commanded immediate silence across the floor. Dr. Harrison Drake scrambled up from the dark corner where he had been cowering, desperation dripping from every pore, his white lab coat smeared with blood and dirt. He rushed toward the CEO and the military colonel, waving his arms frantically. "Mr. Sterling, thank God you're finally here!" Drake shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You must intervene immediately. This facility has suffered a catastrophic security and operational breach. Nurse Mercer, who is under active administrative suspension for gross insubordination, has illegally seized control of my emergency department." Colonel Hayes stopped dead in his tracks, his sharp, weathered eyes locking onto Drake with cold, piercing disdain. "She organized an unauthorized military mutiny with these active duty personnel," Drake continued, his voice rising into a manic pitch as he appealed directly to Mr. Sterling. "She performed invasive surgical procedures, including inserting an unapproved chest decompression needle, without radiological verification or physician supervision. She assaulted me, destroyed hospital property, and used unapproved military surplus gear on civilian patients. I demand her immediate arrest and termination." Mr. Sterling didn't say a word. He turned his head away from Drake, letting his eyes sweep across the trauma bay. He saw 12 wounded Marines resting comfortably on stabilized gurneys, their color returning under the bright tactical lights. He saw young Mateo and the civilian nurses working side by side with military corpsmen. Then, he looked down at the floor and saw the shattered remnants of the syringe Drake had tried to force into Corporal Adams. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots clicking sharply against the clean linoleum floor. He walked right past Dr. Drake, as if the chief medical officer were nothing more than a speck of dust on the pavement. The colonel stopped directly in front of me, coming to a crisp, rigid military halt. He looked at my blood-stained navy scrubs, my steady posture, and the old M5 combat medic bag resting on the central counter. "Senior Chief Sarah Vance," Colonel Hayes said, his deep, authoritative voice echoing clearly across the quiet bay. "The Pentagon received an emergency priority signal from Captain Ramsey 45 minutes ago regarding the mass casualty explosion at the training range, as well as the initial reports of administrative obstruction and refusal of care encountered at this hospital." A sharp murmur rippled through the civilian surgical residents and nurses standing near the central desk. Mr. Sterling stepped closer, his jaw tightening as he looked at Drake. "Colonel Hayes, when my night supervisor called me to report a code black mass casualty disaster, I was told Dr. Drake was personally managing the intake triage." "Dr. Drake was indeed managing the intake, Mr. Sterling," Colonel Hayes replied coldly, turning his gaze back to the CEO. "By screaming at wounded soldiers to stay in idling trucks in the middle of a torrential downpour, refusing to open the doors without digital portal forms, and attempting to chemically paralyze a hypovolemic corporal because he panicked in the dark." "That is a complete fabrication," Drake shrieked, his face turning a toxic shade of purple as he lunged forward. "I was maintaining clinical protocol. We have strict state medical board guidelines and portal metrics. Shut your mouth, Doctor, Colonel Hayes commanded, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp register that made Drake snap his mouth shut instantly. Colonel Hayes raised his hand, signaling to one of the armed military police officers behind him. The officer stepped forward, opened a secure tactical briefcase, and handed the colonel a ruggedized military tablet. During transport and arrival, every second of audio and visual data in this bay was recorded via tactical body camera feeds worn by Petty Officer Jenkins, Colonel Hayes announced, holding the tablet up for the entire room to see. An encrypted live feed was simultaneously transmitted directly to the regional military command server. Drake's face drained of all color. The arrogant, untouchable corporate facade he had maintained for months shattered into dust. "Would you like me to project the recording onto the central display monitor, Mr. Sterling?" Colonel Hayes asked quietly, looking at the CEO. "We can watch Dr. Drake cowering against the wall, refusing to touch a bleeding Marine, and attempting to administer a lethal dose of paralytics to a soldier whose blood pressure was bottoming out." Mr. Sterling looked at Drake with a gaze so cold and intense it could have frozen fire. "No, Colonel," Mr. Sterling said softly, his voice trembling with quiet, burning fury. "That won't be necessary. I think we've all seen enough." Mr. Sterling turned slowly to face the disgraced chief medical officer. "Dr. Harrison Drake," Mr. Sterling said, every word dripping with absolute disgust. "You abandoned 12 wounded United States Marines on our doorstep during an emergency because you were too cowardly to operate without a computer screen. And then you tried to destroy the license and reputation of the combat medic who saved their lives." "Mr. Sterling, please," Drake whimpered, dropping heavily to his knees on the clean floor, clutching at the hem of the CEO's expensive trousers. "The liability risk, the storm, the software failure." "You are fired, Harrison," Mr. Sterling interrupted coldly, pulling his suit trousers away from Drake's trembling fingers. "Effective immediately. Your medical executive privileges are revoked, your office is locked, and your name will be scrubbed from this institution before the sun rises." Drake let out a pathetic, broken sob, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of ruined fabric and total humiliation. Mr. Sterling turned back toward me, his expression softening into one of deep, profound respect. He walked over to the central triage counter and extended his hand. "Nurse Mercer, or rather, Senior Chief Vance, Mr. Sterling said sincerely, shaking my hand with a firm, appreciative grip. "St. Luke Medical Center owes you an unpayable debt. You saved these men when our entire civilian infrastructure failed." Before I could answer, Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan raised himself up slightly on his gurney, his dark, weathered eyes fixed on Colonel Hayes. "Colonel," Callahan rasped out, his gravelly voice carrying across the entire bay, "are we going to let this civilian bureaucrat walk away after nearly killing my men? Or are we going to hold him accountable under federal military oversight?" Colonel Hayes gave Callahan a firm, reassuring nod. "Sergeant Callahan, nobody is walking away." The colonel turned to the 4 armed military police officers standing at attention near the doors. "Military police," Colonel Hayes ordered crisply. "Take Dr. Harrison Drake into federal custody under Title 18 for obstructing emergency medical care during a national security crisis and making false official statements to military authorities." 2 of the armed military police officers stepped forward immediately, their tactical boots clicking loudly against the linoleum floor. They grabbed Drake by both arms, hauling the sobbing, hysterical former doctor up from the floor. Click-clack. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around Drake's wrists with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed loudly through the quiet emergency department. "No, get your hands off me! You can't do this! I am a board-certified surgeon!" Drake shrieked, thrashing wildly as the military police dragged him toward the heavy glass exit doors. "Mr. Sterling, help me! This is an outrage!" Mr. Sterling didn't even blink, watching silently as the doors swung open and the disgraced doctor was escorted out into the gray dawn light, his pathetic screams fading away until the security doors closed shut. The ambulance bay fell into a profound, respectful silence. Colonel Hayes turned back to me. opening a heavy leather portfolio embossed with the official seal of the Department of Defense. He pulled out a crisp, formal military document and handed it across the central counter. "Senior Chief Sarah Vance," Colonel Hayes announced formally, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "By executive order of the Secretary of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs, St. Luke Medical Center's Trauma Division is hereby placed under permanent joint federal military oversight, restructuring this facility into the Joint Regional Combat and Civilian Trauma Center." The colonel paused, looking directly into my eyes with unwavering admiration. "Furthermore, the Department of Defense has officially reviewed your combat record from Helmand Province and Sangin Valley. All administrative disciplinary notes stemming from your wartime field actions have been expunged with full honors. Your record reflects the Navy Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Bronze Star with Valor." A spontaneous, thunderous wave of applause erupted across the ambulance bay. Mateo, Petty Officer Jenkins, the civilian nurses, the surgical residents, and every single one of the 12 wounded Marines began clapping and cheering, their voices filling the room with overwhelming pride and gratitude. Captain Ramsey, who had just stepped through the doors from the triage zone, came to a crisp, rigid military salute. I raised my hand in a sharp, flawless salute back. Colonel Hayes laid a gold pen across the official federal appointment document. "We need a true leader to run this department, Senior Chief," Colonel Hayes said softly, smiling at me. "Chief of Trauma Services is yours, if you'll take it." I looked down at the gold pen, glancing at Mateo and Gunnery Sergeant Callahan, who gave me a firm nod. I picked up the pen and signed my name at the bottom of the federal order without hesitation. Senior Chief Sarah Vance, Chief of Trauma Services. The bay erupted into cheers, celebrating a new era. 3 weeks after the federal oversight order permanently restructured St. Luke Medical Center into the Joint Regional Combat and Civilian Trauma Center, the morning sun broke over the city skyline, casting bright golden light across the newly renovated glass entrance and the pristine brick facade. The dark, chaotic memories of that stormy night had settled deep into the foundation of a completely rebuilt institution. Outside the main entrance, heavy industrial construction crews were putting the finishing touches on the massive dual-redundant generator grid, ensuring that this facility would never experience a power failure under any circumstances again. Every underground cable had been reinforced, and every backup system rigorously tested. Inside the main floor, the changes were even more striking. The cold, sterile corporate atmosphere that Dr. Harrison Drake had enforced for months had been entirely replaced by sharp, military-grade efficiency, combined with deep, compassionate patient care. The waiting room was quiet and orderly, free of frantic families waiting hours for basic updates, while the corridors hummed with purposeful energy and disciplined calm. I walked down the wide, brightly lit main corridor of the ER wing, wearing my crisp dark navy scrubs with my official Chief ID badge pinned proudly to my chest. My boots made a steady, rhythmic sound against the polished linoleum floor, a stark contrast to the quiet, hesitant footsteps I used to take when I tried to hide in the background. Beside me walked Mateo, looking confident, upright, and wearing his new assistant chief nurse badge with quiet, deserved pride. He was holding a digital tablet, reviewing the morning shift assignments with practiced ease and calm authority, occasionally stopping to verify supply counts with passing residents and medical interns who respected his leadership. "All trauma bays are fully prepped, sterilized, and stocked, Chief Mercer," Mateo reported smoothly, his voice grounded, mature, and professional. "To ensure complete readiness, 4 military medical specialists are assigned to Bay 1 and Bay 2 for the morning shift. The new blackout simulation protocols were successfully executed by the resident team at 0600 hours with a 100% compliance rate." "Excellent work, Mateo," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "How is the nursing staff handling the new triage structure compared to the old portal system?" "They love it," Mateo grinned, looking back over his shoulder at the bustling station. "No one is rushing patient discharges to meet artificial portal timers anymore. The focus is entirely on clinical safety, accurate diagnostics, and patient outcomes. It actually feels like a true emergency department now, where human lives matter more than administrative spreadsheets." "Keep reinforcing that standard," I instructed, checking my clipboard. Clinical competence always comes first. Metrics are secondary. Always, Chief. Mateo nodded firmly. We stopped outside Trauma Bay 1. The heavy glass doors parted smoothly as Gunnery Sergeant Frank Callahan and 3 other members of his breaching unit walked down the corridor. Callahan was still wearing a light physical therapy brace on his right thigh, where the femoral artery had been surgically repaired, but he stood tall, his posture straight, military, and unyielding. He stopped right in front of me, offering a firm, respectful handshake that carried the solid weight of mutual respect forged under fire. "Chief Mercer," Gunnery Sergeant Callahan said, his gravelly voice filled with deep appreciation. "My men and I are being officially discharged back to base this morning after our final evaluations. Before we leave the facility, we wanted to present you with something." Callahan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box, handing it across to me with both hands. I opened the box. Inside rested a polished silver challenge coin, bearing the emblem of 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and the crossed medical insignia of a Fleet Marine Force corpsman. That coin means that whenever you or your trauma department need anything from our unit, specialized equipment, tactical medical transport, or direct field backing, you call us directly, Callahan said quietly, his dark eyes unwavering. You saved 12 lives that night, Chief. You always were, and always will be our doc. "Thank you, Sergeant," I said, closing the box and holding it tightly in my hand. "It was an honor to stand beside you." Callahan and his men gave me a sharp, crisp military salute, which I returned with absolute pride, before walking down the corridor toward the exit where their transport vehicle waited in the bright morning sun. I watched them leave, feeling a deep, abiding sense of peace settle over my chest. The ghosts of Ramadi and Sangin no longer felt like a dark secret I had to bury beneath scrubs and silence. They were part of the resilience that allowed me to stand tall today. I walked back down to the central nursing station. The morning light poured through the large glass windows, illuminating the corridor where civilian nurses and military medics worked side by side, checking equipment, discussing patient care plans, and preparing for the day ahead with smooth, synchronized teamwork. Colonel Hayes walked out of the command office, holding a clipboard with the updated tactical transport schedules. He gave me a warm, approving nod as he approached. "Everything looks tight and ready for action, Chief Mercer," Hayes said, pausing by the desk. "That's how we keep it, Colonel," I replied calmly. "Zero margin for error across any sector. By the way," Hayes added with a faint smirk, "the Department of Justice just forwarded the final docket regarding Harrison Drake's upcoming federal trial. His bail was officially denied again this morning by the federal judge. He's facing up to 20 years in federal prison for medical record fraud, obstruction of emergency care during a national security event, and making false official statements to federal agents. A man who spent his entire career hiding behind titles and portal metrics finally found out where vanity gets you when lives are on the line," I said softly, looking toward the exit doors where Drake used to strut. "Indeed," Hayes nodded. "And the hospital board has elected Victor Sterling to permanently retain his position as CEO under the new Joint Oversight Charter, provided he keeps administrative interference strictly out of your trauma bays. He knows better than to try," I noted with a confident smirk. I spent the next 2 hours conducting joint civilian-military rounds with the resident physicians, reviewing advanced diagnostic protocols, and ensuring every single nursing station was fully optimized for rapid emergency response. The atmosphere was completely transformed. No one whispered in fear or rushed through critical evaluations to beat an arbitrary clock. Every physician and nurse understood that saving lives required absolute dedication and unhurried focus. We held detailed briefings on advanced hemorrhage control and coordinated airway management, establishing a culture where every voice mattered regardless of rank or background. As I reviewed patient charts at the central desk, I remembered the dusty combat tents in Sangin Valley, where every second counted, and every decision was a matter of life and death. For a long time, I thought I had left that person behind in the desert, but that stormy night proved that the instincts forged in combat never truly fade. They simply wait for the moment when they are needed most, reminding us why we chose this sacred calling in the first place, and strengthening our resolve to protect every single soul that crosses our threshold without hesitation, doubt, or administrative compromise. Mateo stepped up to my side, holding a fresh cup of black coffee and smiling warmly. You know, Chief, looking at how far this department has come in 3 weeks makes every sleepless night worthwhile. We finally have an emergency room that honors healing over corporate profits, and the entire staff is proud to stand behind your leadership through every challenge ahead. Nurses and corpsmen built this together, Mateo, I replied, taking the cup and feeling the warmth against my fingers. And we built it on a foundation of absolute truth and clinical excellence that no bureaucrat will ever tear down again. Resting in a place of permanent honor on the shelf right behind the central station, illuminated by a clean glass display case, was my old M5 combat medic bag. The faded canvas, the hand-stitched repairs, and the faint dark stains from combat zones were no longer hidden away or threatened with a trash bin. They were a testament to courage, resilience, and the unyielding refusal to let people die in the dark. Suddenly, the red emergency radio on the central station desk buzzed to life, its sharp tone cutting clean through the steady hum of the room. Bzzzt. Joint trauma. This is Paramedic Unit 4. We have a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate incoming. 2 critical red code traumas with severe crush injuries and internal hemorrhaging. ETA, 4 minutes. Mateo looked at me instantly, his face composed, sharp, and completely ready for the incoming shock. Bay 1 and Bay 2, prepped, Mateo called out loudly, his voice echoing authoritatively across the entire ER station. Team Alpha, fall in. Prepare rapid infusers, whole blood units, and field surgical trays. The staff moved with fluid, practiced precision. There was no panic, no screaming, and no arrogance. Just a dedicated team moving as one to save human lives. I unhitched my stethoscope from my belt, looped it around my neck, and stepped up to the central line in Trauma Bay 1. I looked down at the silver challenge coin in my pocket, then at the bright lights overhead. For 18 months, I had hidden in the quiet shadows, trying to run away from who I was and what I had survived. But as the double red doors of the ambulance bay burst open and the transport gurneys rolled in, I knew I was finally where I belonged. I was no longer the quiet nurse they sent home. I was Senior Chief Hannah Mercer, Valkyrie, and as long as I was standing in this bay, breathing and leading my team, absolutely nobody was ever going to die in the dark again.